Before we begin, pause for a moment. Not because something is wrong, but because this moment matters more than you realize. Your life is not shaped only by what happens to you. It is shaped by what happens inside you every single day, every single hour, every single quiet moment when no one is watching. Right now, thoughts are passing through your mind. Some are gentle, some are heavy, some are old voices you didn't choose, but learned to believe. And here is the truth most people never hear. Your thoughts are not harmless. They are instructions. They tell your body how to feel. They tell your heart what to expect. They tell your future what to become. Most people try to change their life by changing their surroundings. New jobs, new people, new habits. But they never touch the control room. This audiobook is about that control room. Once you learn to control your thoughts, your whole life does not change overnight. It changes permanently. Listen slowly. Listen honestly. Because by the end of this audiobook, you will not think the same way again. Chapter 1. The invisible voice running your life. There is a voice inside you that never sleeps. It speaks before you open your eyes in the morning. It speaks while you brush your teeth. It speaks when you are silent in a room full of people. It speaks when you are alone with the lights off. This voice does not knock. It does not ask permission. It simply talks. Most people believe they are living their life consciously, making choices freely, deciding their future with intention. But the truth is quieter and far more unsettling. Most people are being spoken into a life they never chose. That invisible voice decides whether you feel confident or insecure before you even step outside. It decides whether you interpret a challenge as an opportunity or a threat. It decides whether you see yourself as capable or inadequate, worthy or behind, growing or failing. And the most dangerous part is this. You trust this voice without ever questioning where it came from. Some of its words are not even yours. They are echoes. Echoes of things you heard when you were younger. Echoes of criticism that stayed longer than praise. Echoes of moments when you tried and failed and promised yourself never to feel that pain again. That voice learned how to speak by watching what hurt you. When you failed once, it learned fear. When you were embarrassed, it learned avoidance. When you were ignored, it learned self-doubt. Over time, the voice did not just comment on your life. It began to direct it. It learned when to speak louder. It learned when to whisper. It learned when to sound reasonable so you would never challenge it. It says things like, "Now is not the right time. You are not ready yet. Others are better than you. Stay quiet. Don't risk it. Don't hope too much." And because it sounds familiar, you believe it. You don't argue with it. You don't question it. You assume it is you. But this is where control begins. That voice is not your identity. It is a habit. A mental habit built slowly, invisibly, over years of repetition. Every time you listened without questioning, it grew stronger. Every time you obeyed without examining, it gained authority. Every time you assumed it was telling the truth, it became more convincing. This is why two people can live in the same world but experience completely different lives. One walks into uncertainty and feels curiosity. The other walks into uncertainty and feels panic. The event is the same. The voice interpreting it is different. This is the invisible force shaping your confidence, your anxiety, your discipline, your courage, and your peace. You may think your problem is motivation. It is not. You may think your problem is discipline. It is not. You may think your problem is circumstances. It is not. Your real problem and your greatest opportunity lives in the quiet commentary playing in your mind. When that voice is chaotic, life feels overwhelming. When that voice is fearful, life feels limited. When that voice is harsh, life feels exhausting. But when that voice becomes steady, life begins to soften. Control does not start with force. It starts with awareness. For the first time, you must listen to the voice instead of listening as the voice. Notice how it speaks when you make a mistake. Does it correct you or punish you? Notice how it speaks when you succeed. Does it allow pride or rush you into fear of losing it? Notice how it speaks when you rest. Does it allow peace or whisper guilt? This voice has been shaping your nervous system, your emotional responses, your sense of self, and your future direction. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, like water shaping stone. And yet, this voice is not fixed. It was learned, and anything learned can be retrained. Control begins the moment you realize, I do not have to believe every thought I hear. That realization alone weakens years of unconscious influence. You are not broken. Your mind is not against you. You were simply never taught how to lead it. And once you learn to lead the voice inside you, you stop being pushed through life. You begin to walk it deliberately, calmly, and awake. This is where your transformation truly begins. Chapter 2. Why your brain is not your enemy. For most of your life, you may have believed that your mind is the problem, that your brain is working against you, that if only you could silence it, slow it down, or escape it, your life would finally feel lighter, calmer, and more manageable. But this belief itself is one of the greatest misunderstandings you have ever been taught. Your brain is not your enemy. It never was, and it never will be, because everything it does, even the things that feel uncomfortable, overwhelming, or exhausting, comes from a single purpose: to protect you and keep you alive. The human brain was not designed to make you peaceful, fulfilled, or confident. It was designed to keep you safe in an unpredictable world, and for thousands of years, that job required constant alertness, fast reactions, and a strong memory for pain, danger, and loss. Your brain learned that remembering what hurt you was more important than remembering what made you happy, because forgetting pain once meant death, while forgetting joy rarely carried consequences. This is why negative thoughts feel louder, heavier, and more convincing than positive ones. Not because they are truer, but because your brain treats them as urgent signals rather than optional reflections. When your mind replays a past mistake again and again, it is not trying to punish you, it is trying to prevent you from experiencing the same pain twice. When your thoughts jump to worst-case scenarios, it is not trying to make you anxious, it is trying to prepare you for potential danger. When your mind resists change, even when change could improve your life, it is not being lazy or stubborn, it is prioritizing familiarity over uncertainty, because from the brain's perspective, familiar discomfort feels safer than unfamiliar possibility. The problem begins when protection turns into overprotection, when the brain continues using survival strategies in situations that no longer require them, when ancient defense mechanisms operate in a modern world where the threats are emotional rather than physical. Your brain does not understand embarrassment, rejection, or failure the way you do. It processes them as threats to belonging, identity, and safety. And so it responds with fear, avoidance, and caution, even when courage would serve you better. This is why you can logically understand that you are capable, that you have grown, that the past is over, and still feel hesitation, self-doubt, or anxiety rising within you, because logic speaks to the conscious mind, while fear lives deeper, in patterns formed long before conscious reasoning takes control. The brain does not respond to words alone. It responds to repetition, emotion, and experience, which is why simply telling yourself to be confident or stop overthinking rarely works, and often makes you feel more frustrated, as if you are failing at something that should be simple. To regain control, you must first stop fighting your mind and start understanding it, because the moment you treat your brain as an enemy, you strengthen the internal conflict that keeps you stuck. Control does not come from domination. It comes from leadership, and leadership begins with compassion, patience, and clarity. Just as a skilled guide does not shout at a frightened traveler but calmly shows them the path forward, you must learn to guide your mind instead of attacking it for reacting the only way it knows how. Your brain learns through association, meaning that every time you respond to fear with panic, avoidance, or self-criticism, you reinforce the idea that fear was justified. But every time you respond to fear with steadiness, curiosity, and intentional action, you teach your brain that it does not need to sound the alarm so loudly. Over time, this changes the way your mind reacts, not because you silenced it, but because you retrained it. It is important to understand that your mind does not speak in words alone. It speaks in sensations, emotions, and impulses. A tight chest, a restless body, a racing heart, a sudden urge to distract yourself. These are all forms of communication, signals that your nervous system is trying to send you. When you ignore these signals or judge them harshly, they grow stronger. But when you acknowledge them without panic, they begin to soften, because the brain feels heard and no longer needs to escalate. Most people try to control their thoughts by force, pushing away uncomfortable ideas, suppressing emotions, or distracting themselves endlessly, but this only teaches the brain that those thoughts are dangerous and must be monitored more closely. True control comes from allowing thoughts to arise without immediately obeying them, from observing them with distance rather than drowning in them, from recognizing that a thought can exist without becoming a command. Your brain believes what you repeatedly show it through action, not what you occasionally tell it through words. If you consistently act as though you are incapable, unworthy, or unsafe, your brain will reinforce those beliefs. But if you repeatedly take small, steady actions that contradict fear, your brain slowly updates its understanding of reality. This is why lasting change feels gradual rather than dramatic, because the brain learns in patterns, not moments. It is also why patience is not optional in mental training, because your brain is not broken. It is simply loyal to the habits you taught it over time. You cannot expect it to unlearn years of conditioning in a few days, just as you would not expect a muscle to strengthen overnight. Every time you return your attention, every time you choose response over reaction, every time you pause instead of panic, you are teaching your brain a new language, one built on steadiness rather than fear. When you stop seeing your mind as the obstacle and start seeing it as a system that can be trained, everything changes. Because instead of feeling trapped inside your own head, you begin to feel like a participant in shaping your inner world. You no longer ask, "What is wrong with me?" and instead begin to ask, "What is my mind trying to protect me from, and how can I show it that I am safe?" This shift alone reduces resistance, because compassion dissolves tension and understanding creates space for change. You realize that control is not about eliminating fear, but about moving forward even when fear speaks, about choosing intention over impulse, about guiding the mind gently back to the present moment again and again. Your brain is powerful, adaptive, and responsive. And once it learns that you are capable of handling discomfort without collapsing, it slowly relaxes its grip. The thoughts that once felt overwhelming lose their urgency. The fears that once dictated your choices begin to sound quieter, and the mental noise that once dominated your days starts to settle, not because you forced silence, but because safety was restored. This is the foundation of true mental control, not suppression, not denial, but cooperation. When your brain learns that you are listening, that you are leading, and that you are capable, it stops fighting you and starts supporting you. And from this place of understanding, you are finally ready to move beyond survival and begin shaping a life guided not by fear, but by clarity, intention, and calm strength. Chapter 3. The silent damage uncontrolled thoughts create. Most people believe their thoughts are harmless because they are invisible, because no one else can hear them, because they leave no physical mark. But what is unseen is often what shapes us the most. Uncontrolled thoughts do not arrive dramatically. They do not announce destruction. They arrive quietly, repeatedly, patiently, until they become the background noise of your life, influencing every decision, every emotion, every expectation, without you ever realizing how much power you handed them. A single negative thought does not ruin a life, but a repeated one slowly builds a reality. The mind learns through repetition, and when the same doubts, fears, and judgments are played again and again, they stop feeling like thoughts and begin to feel like facts. Over time, you stop asking whether they are true and start living as if they are. This is how limitation becomes normal, how anxiety becomes familiar, and how self-doubt becomes identity. Uncontrolled thoughts quietly drain your energy before the day has even begun. You wake up tired, not because you did nothing, but because your mind worked all night replaying worries, rehearsing conversations that never happened, revisiting mistakes that cannot be changed, imagining futures that have not arrived. The body follows the mind, and when the mind never rests, the body carries the weight. This exhaustion is not physical, it is cognitive, emotional, and deeply internal. When thoughts remain unchecked, they begin to distort perception. Neutral situations start to feel threatening. Silence starts to feel like rejection. Small setbacks feel like proof of failure. Your nervous system responds to imagined danger as if it were real, releasing stress signals, tightening muscles, accelerating the heart, preparing you to fight or flee from problems that exist only in thought. Over time, this constant state of alertness becomes your baseline, and peace starts to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Uncontrolled thinking also erodes confidence slowly and invisibly. Confidence is not lost in one moment. It fades through countless internal conversations where you doubt yourself before you try, criticize yourself while you act, and judge yourself after you finish. Even success becomes heavy because instead of feeling satisfaction, your mind immediately searches for what could go wrong next. Joy is shortened, pride is muted, and progress feels temporary. Relationships are not immune to this internal damage. When thoughts are left unchecked, you begin to assume intentions, predict abandonment, replay words until they lose their original meaning. You respond not to what people actually say, but to what your mind tells you they meant. Over time, this creates distance, misunderstandings, and emotional walls that feel justified, even when they are built on imagined narratives rather than reality. The most dangerous cost of uncontrolled thoughts is not fear or sadness, but stagnation. You stop trying not because you lack ability, but because your mind convinces you that effort is pointless. You delay decisions, postpone dreams, and shrink goals until they feel safe enough to attempt, and then wonder why life feels smaller than it should. Potential is not lost suddenly. It is slowly abandoned through internal permission to stay where you are. Uncontrolled thoughts also teach the brain to confuse comfort with safety. Familiar misery begins to feel safer than unfamiliar growth. Even when opportunities appear, the mind highlights risk, uncertainty, and discomfort, pushing you back toward what is known, even if it is unfulfilling. This is how people stay in cycles. They outgrow, not because they want to suffer, but because their thoughts frame change as danger. What makes this damage so powerful is that it feels logical. Uncontrolled thoughts rarely sound extreme. They sound reasonable, cautious, realistic. They disguise fear as wisdom, avoidance as patience, and self-doubt as humility. Because they sound rational, they are rarely questioned. And because they are rarely questioned, they become trusted advisors, even when they quietly sabotage progress. Over time, the mind becomes crowded. There is no space between thoughts, no pause to breathe, no silence to reset. Mental clutter becomes emotional clutter, and emotional clutter becomes physical tension. You feel overwhelmed by simple decisions, drained by small tasks, irritated without knowing why. Life feels heavier, not because it changed, but because your internal load increased. Uncontrolled thinking also disconnects you from the present moment. You are rarely fully where you are. While your body is here, your mind is elsewhere, replaying the past or rehearsing the future. Moments pass without being experienced. Conversations happen without being felt. Days end without being remembered. Time moves, but presence does not. This is why control is not about positivity, it is about clarity. It is not about forcing optimism, but about preventing mental chaos from running unchecked. When thoughts remain uncontrolled, they multiply, overlap, and contradict each other, creating inner noise that drowns intuition, wisdom, and calm decision-making. You stop trusting yourself because you cannot hear yourself clearly anymore. Yet none of this means you are weak. It means you are human, living without mental boundaries. No one taught you how to filter thoughts, how to pause before believing, how to separate observation from interpretation. You were taught how to survive externally, but not how to manage your inner world. And what is unmanaged will always manage you. The moment you begin to recognize the cost of uncontrolled thinking, you reclaim responsibility without shame. You stop blaming yourself and start observing patterns. You notice how certain thoughts always lead to the same emotions, how certain emotions always lead to the same behaviors, and how those behaviors always lead to the same outcomes. Awareness breaks the illusion of randomness and reveals the structure behind your experience. Control begins when you realize that not every thought deserves your attention, not every emotion deserves your reaction, and not every inner voice deserves authority. Some thoughts are warnings, some are habits, some are echoes, and some are simply noise. Learning the difference is what separates a reactive life from an intentional one. As you move forward, you will begin to feel space returning. Not silence, but space. Space between thought and response. Space between emotion and action. Space between who you were and who you are becoming. In that space, choice lives. In that space, growth begins. And in that space, you finally experience what it means to guide your life from the inside out, rather than being dragged forward by a mind that was never meant to lead alone. Chapter 4. You are not your thoughts, but you have been living as if you are. For most of your life, you have believed that every thought that appears in your mind is a reflection of who you are, what you believe, and what you are capable of. But this belief has quietly imprisoned you in a reality that was never meant to be permanent. The mind produces thoughts the way the heart produces beats, automatically, continuously, without asking for permission. Yet, somewhere along the way, you were taught, directly or indirectly, to identify with everything your mind says, to merge your identity with your internal dialogue, and to live as if questioning a thought was the same as denying yourself. This is one of the most subtle but damaging confusions of human experience, because the moment you believe that you are your thoughts, you surrender control without realizing it. Every doubt becomes a verdict. Every fear becomes a warning. Every passing judgment becomes a definition. You stop observing your mind and start living inside it, reacting to every internal movement as if it were reality itself rather than a temporary mental event. A thought is not a fact, but when you identify with it, it gains the authority of truth. A thought is not a command, but when you fuse with it, it gains the power of instruction. This is how people live entire lives governed by ideas that were never examined, never chosen, and never consciously accepted, but simply repeated often enough to feel familiar. Familiarity creates trust, and trust creates obedience, even when the source is unreliable. Your mind constantly labels experiences, people, and situations, often within seconds, sometimes within moments so brief you barely notice them. These labels shape emotion, and emotion shapes behavior. The world does not meet you directly. It meets you through interpretation, and interpretation is built from thought. When you believe you are your thoughts, you never question interpretation, and when interpretation goes unchallenged, reality becomes distorted without resistance. This is why awareness feels uncomfortable at first, because it introduces distance between you and the voice you have always assumed was you. When you begin to notice a thought rather than become it, there is a moment of uncertainty, a brief feeling of disorientation, as if you are standing slightly outside yourself. That discomfort is not danger, it is freedom beginning to form. The mind resists separation because separation weakens its automatic authority, and authority is what keeps habits alive. You were never meant to eliminate thought, silence the mind, or achieve permanent inner quiet, because thought itself is not the enemy. The problem has never been thinking, the problem has been identification. When you identify with a thought, you react automatically, but when you observe a thought, you regain choice. Choice changes everything, because choice breaks compulsion, and compulsion is what keeps old patterns in control. Imagine watching clouds move across the sky without believing the sky has become the clouds. The clouds may be dark, heavy, fast-moving, or chaotic, but the sky remains open, untouched, unchanged by what passes through it. Your mind is the sky, your thoughts are the clouds, and for years you have been mistaking passing weather for permanent structure. Once you see this clearly, even briefly, something shifts that cannot be undone. This realization does not instantly remove fear, sadness, or doubt, but it changes your relationship with them. Fear becomes something you experience rather than something you obey. Sadness becomes something you feel rather than something you become. Doubt becomes information rather than identity. This shift alone reduces suffering, because much of pain comes not from emotion itself, but from resistance to it, from believing it defines you rather than moves through you. When you stop identifying with every thought, you also stop taking everything personally. A critical thought no longer feels like an attack on your worth. A fearful thought no longer feels like a prophecy, and a negative assumption no longer feels like reality. There is space now, space to breathe, space to respond, space to decide whether a thought deserves your attention or your dismissal. This space is subtle, but it is powerful, because in that space you are no longer trapped inside reaction. The mind will attempt to pull you back into identification, especially when emotions are strong, because emotional intensity reduces distance. This is why moments of stress, conflict, or fatigue feel overwhelming, not because they are stronger, but because awareness weakens under pressure. Training awareness is not about perfection, it is about returning again and again to observation rather than absorption, noticing rather than believing, witnessing rather than obeying. Over time, this practice changes the nervous system. The body begins to feel safer because it is no longer reacting to every thought as if it were a threat. The constant internal tension softens, breathing deepens, and emotional waves pass more quickly. You are not suppressing emotion, you are allowing it without being consumed by it. This balance creates resilience, not through hardness, but through flexibility. As identification loosens, you begin to recognize patterns. You notice how certain thoughts appear in the same situations, how they repeat the same language, carry the same tone, and lead to the same emotional outcomes. Patterns lose power once they are seen, because awareness interrupts automation. What once felt inevitable now feels predictable, and what is predictable can be redirected. This is the moment where responsibility returns without blame. You stop asking why your mind is like this and start asking how you relate to it. The question shifts from self-judgment to self-leadership. Leadership requires distance, and distance requires awareness. This is why control begins, not with effort, but with observation, not with force, but with clarity. As you continue listening, allow yourself to notice thoughts as they arise, not to change them, not to correct them, but simply to see them. Notice their tone, their urgency, their familiarity. Notice how quickly the mind wants you to react and how uncomfortable it feels to pause instead. That pause is not weakness, it is mastery, forming quietly beneath the surface. You are not your thoughts, but you are the one who hears them. You are the awareness that notices them, the presence that contains them, the space in which they appear and disappear. This awareness has always been there, untouched by fear, unbroken by doubt, unchanged by failure. You have simply been distracted from it by noise. When you reconnect with this awareness, life does not suddenly become easy, but it becomes navigable. You stop being dragged by mental weather and start steering through it. The storms still come, but they no longer decide your direction. And from this place of separation, strength begins to grow, not loud or forceful, but steady, grounded, and unshakable. This is where real control begins, not in domination of the mind, but in liberation from identification with it. And once this separation becomes familiar, once awareness becomes your default rather than reaction, your entire inner world reorganizes itself around clarity instead of chaos. From here forward, every chapter builds on this foundation, because without this understanding, control is impossible, and with it, transformation is inevitable. Chapter 5. The moment you stop obeying every thought, power returns. There comes a quiet but decisive moment in inner growth when you realize that awareness alone is not enough, because seeing a thought does not automatically free you from its influence, and understanding your mind does not instantly stop old patterns from pulling you back into familiar reactions. This is the moment where many people become discouraged, believing that because they are still affected by fear, doubt, or inner resistance, they have somehow failed, when in reality they have reached the exact point where real control begins to develop. Control does not mean the absence of thoughts, and it does not mean that difficult thoughts stop appearing, because the mind will continue to generate ideas, warnings, memories, and predictions as long as you are alive. Control means that a thought can arise without immediately turning into action, emotion, or belief. It means that a thought can knock without being invited in, that it can speak without being obeyed, that it can exist without defining your next move. For most of your life, thoughts have moved directly into behavior without pause. A doubt appeared and you withdrew. A fear appeared and you delayed. A judgment appeared and you reacted emotionally. There was no space between the thought and the response, which made the response feel automatic, inevitable, and uncontrollable. What you are learning now is how to build that space, not once, but repeatedly, until it becomes familiar. This space does not come from force, because force creates resistance, and resistance strengthens what you are trying to escape. The mind reacts defensively when it feels attacked, and defensive minds become louder, more urgent, and more convincing. True control is quiet. It is the calm decision to pause when everything inside you urges you to react. It is the willingness to sit with discomfort long enough for it to lose authority. When a thought appears that once would have controlled you, such as fear of failure, fear of judgment, or fear of loss, your instinct may be to argue with it, to prove it wrong, or to replace it with something positive. But arguing keeps you engaged, and engagement feeds the thought. Instead, control begins when you acknowledge the thought without agreeing with it. When you say internally, "This is a thought, not a command. This is a sensation, not a threat. This is familiar, but it does not decide." At first, this feels unnatural, because you have been trained to respond immediately. Pausing may feel like weakness, indecision, or avoidance, but in reality, it is strength developing beneath the surface. In that pause, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. It learns that urgency does not always require action, that discomfort does not always require escape, that fear does not always require obedience. This retraining happens slowly, not because you are incapable, but because your mind has been loyal to old patterns for a long time. Loyalty does not disappear overnight. Each time you pause instead of reacting, you send a new signal to your brain, a signal that says you are safe enough to choose rather than react. Over time, this signal becomes stronger than the old alarm system, and the mind begins to soften its grip. Control also means learning when not to engage at all. Not every thought deserves analysis, correction, or attention. Some thoughts are mental noise, remnants of stress, fatigue, or habit. Engaging with every thought gives them importance they do not deserve. Disengagement is not avoidance, it is discernment. You begin to sense which thoughts require reflection and which should be allowed to pass without comment. As this discernment grows, emotional regulation follows naturally. Emotions no longer hijack behavior as quickly because they are no longer fueled by unquestioned thoughts. Anger still arises, but it passes more quickly. Anxiety still appears, but it no longer dictates decisions. Sadness still visits, but it no longer defines identity. You stop fighting emotions and start allowing them to move through you without giving them control over direction. This process is deeply uncomfortable at times, because growth always asks you to tolerate feelings you once avoided. The urge to distract yourself, to escape, or to return to familiar patterns may become strong, especially when you begin changing how you respond. But this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is evidence that old patterns are losing authority. The mind resists change not because it is harmful, but because it is unfamiliar. Consistency matters more than intensity here. One moment of control does not change a life, but repeated moments of pause reshape the inner landscape over time. Each time you choose awareness over impulse, you weaken the old pathway and strengthen a new one. Eventually, what once required effort becomes natural, and what once felt impossible becomes ordinary. As you stop obeying every thought, something profound happens to your sense of self. You no longer feel at the mercy of your inner world. You begin to trust yourself, not because the mind is silent, but because you know you can handle whatever arises without losing direction. This trust builds confidence that is quiet, grounded, and resilient, not dependent on constant reassurance or perfect circumstances. You also begin to experience freedom that does not depend on outcomes. Whether things go well or not, you remain internally steady. You act from intention rather than fear, from clarity rather than urgency. Life becomes less reactive and more deliberate. Decisions feel cleaner, regret lessens. Even mistakes feel easier to recover from because they are no longer interpreted as proof of inadequacy. This is the stage where people often say they feel lighter, even though nothing external has changed. The weight that lifts is not circumstance, it is internal resistance. When you stop fighting your thoughts and stop obeying them blindly, mental energy returns, focus sharpens, presence deepens. You begin to live more in the moment, not because the future no longer matters, but because the present is no longer overshadowed by constant mental interference. Control, at this level, is not rigid. It is flexible, responsive, and compassionate. You are firm when needed, gentle when needed, and patient always. You no longer demand perfection from yourself because you understand the nature of the mind. Progress becomes sustainable because it is rooted in understanding rather than self-criticism. As this chapter closes, recognize that this is not a skill you master once and forget. It is a relationship you continue to develop. Some days will feel easier, some days harder, but the direction remains the same. Each pause strengthens you. Each conscious choice builds momentum. Each moment of non-obedience to an unhelpful thought returns a piece of your power. From here forward, your life is no longer dictated by every idea that passes through your mind. You are learning to listen without surrendering, to feel without collapsing, and to think without being trapped. This is not control as domination, it is control as self-leadership, and once this leadership begins to stabilize, the changes that follow reach far beyond the mind, shaping behavior, identity, and the life you gradually, deliberately create. Chapter 6. When controlled thoughts begin to rewrite who you are. There is a moment in this journey when you begin to notice that the work you are doing inside your mind is no longer limited to managing reactions or calming emotions, but is slowly, quietly reshaping the way you see yourself. And this moment is far more powerful than it appears, because identity is not something you are born with fully formed. It is something you construct gradually through repeated thoughts, interpretations, and internal agreements about who you are and what kind of life you are allowed to live. For most people, identity feels fixed, as if it were a solid structure built long ago. But in truth, it is more like a story that has been told so many times it started to feel permanent. Every thought you repeat about yourself becomes a sentence in that story. Every conclusion you draw about your abilities becomes a paragraph. Every emotional reaction you justify becomes a chapter. Over time, the story hardens, and you forget that you were ever the author. Uncontrolled thoughts do not just create emotions, they create self-definitions. When you repeatedly think of yourself as someone who struggles, someone who hesitates, someone who falls behind, those thoughts slowly become expectations, and expectations shape behavior. You stop attempting certain things not because you cannot do them, but because your internal narrative quietly decided that they are not meant for you. This is how potential is limited not by circumstance, but by identity. As you gain control over your thoughts, something subtle begins to happen. You stop reinforcing the old story. Not all at once, not dramatically, but consistently. You notice a familiar, self-critical thought arise, and instead of accepting it as truth, you recognize it as an old line from an outdated script. You do not fight it, but you also do not build on it. This refusal to reinforce the old narrative weakens it over time, and in the absence of repetition, it begins to fade. At the same time, new thoughts begin to appear, not forced affirmations or unrealistic optimism, but quieter, steadier perspectives that sound more grounded. Thoughts like, maybe I can handle this, maybe I do not need to rush, maybe one step is enough today, maybe this discomfort is part of growth. These thoughts may feel unfamiliar at first, even suspicious, because they do not match the old identity you are used to. But unfamiliar does not mean false. It simply means new. Identity shifts do not feel like sudden transformations. They feel like small changes in posture, tone, and reaction. You notice that you recover from setbacks more quickly. You notice that you speak to yourself with slightly more patience. You notice that you are less reactive in situations that once overwhelmed you. These changes may seem insignificant, but they are evidence that the internal structure is being rebuilt quietly, layer by layer. As controlled thinking stabilizes, behavior begins to change naturally. You no longer need to force discipline as much because resistance has less power. Procrastination decreases, not because you became stricter with yourself, but because fear no longer dominates the decision-making process. You begin to act even when uncertainty is present, not recklessly, but deliberately, because your thoughts no longer exaggerate risk beyond reality. This is where long-term direction begins to shift. When identity changes, choices change. When choices change, patterns change. And when patterns change, outcomes follow. The life you live 5 years from now is not shaped by a single decision, but by the identity you consistently act from. Controlled thoughts create an identity that responds rather than reacts, that considers rather than panics, that persists rather than withdraws. One of the most powerful effects of this shift is how you relate to difficulty. Challenges no longer feel like personal failures or signs that something is wrong with you. They begin to feel like information, feedback, and opportunities to refine your approach. This change alone removes an enormous emotional burden because you stop interpreting struggle as proof of inadequacy and start seeing it as part of the process of becoming capable. As identity strengthens, comparison loses its grip. When your sense of self is unstable, comparison feels threatening because it constantly challenges your worth. But when identity is grounded internally, comparison becomes less relevant. You may still notice others' success, but it no longer defines your value or direction. You become focused on your own path, your own pace, your own progress. And this focus creates a quiet confidence that does not need validation. Controlled thoughts also reshape how you experience time. The urgency that once drove anxiety begins to soften. You stop feeling constantly behind, constantly late, constantly pressured to become someone else immediately. You recognize that growth unfolds gradually, and that rushing only creates more resistance. Patience becomes easier, not because you forced it, but because your thoughts no longer frame time as an enemy. As this inner stability grows, relationships begin to change as well. You communicate more clearly because you are less defensive. You listen more deeply because you are less occupied with internal noise. You set boundaries more calmly because you are less afraid of disapproval. These changes may surprise others, not because you became louder or more dominant, but because you became steadier and more self-directed. There will still be moments when old thoughts return with intensity, especially during stress, fatigue, or emotional vulnerability. This does not mean you are regressing. It means you are human. What changes is how long those thoughts stay in control. Instead of spiraling for days, you recover in hours. Instead of losing direction completely, you regain clarity more quickly. This shortening of recovery time is one of the clearest signs of growth. Over time, the internal environment you live in becomes more spacious. There is less mental clutter, fewer internal arguments, and more moments of quiet presence. You begin to trust your inner world because it is no longer chaotic. Decisions feel clearer because they are not clouded by constant fear-based thinking. You feel more aligned, not because life is perfect, but because your mind is no longer working against your intentions. This is when people often describe feeling like themselves for the first time, even though nothing external has changed dramatically. What they are experiencing is alignment between thought, emotion, and action. When these three elements move in the same direction, energy is conserved rather than wasted, and life feels more fluid, more intentional, and more meaningful. As this chapter comes to a close, understand that identity is not something you wait to discover. It is something you build through the thoughts you choose to engage with daily. Every moment of awareness strengthens the new structure. Every pause weakens the old one. You are no longer at the mercy of the story you inherited. You are learning how to write a new one, not through force or fantasy, but through disciplined, compassionate control of your inner world. From this place, the changes ahead become inevitable, because once identity shifts, behavior follows. And once behavior follows, life reorganizes itself around the person you are becoming. This is not sudden transformation, it is lasting change. And it is happening now, quietly, steadily, every time you choose control over compulsion and clarity over chaos. Chapter 7. When your thoughts begin to decide the direction of your life. There comes a stage in inner growth when you realize that controlling your thoughts is no longer only about emotional stability, confidence, or peace, but about direction, because direction is where a life is truly shaped. Many people live for years without consciously choosing where they are going, not because they lack ambition, but because their thoughts quietly decide for them, steering them towards safety, familiarity, and avoidance rather than toward meaning, growth, and fulfillment. A life without conscious direction is not chaotic on the surface. It often looks functional, routine, even successful by external standards, but internally it feels hollow, repetitive, and disconnected. Days blend together. Effort feels heavy. Motivation rises and falls without explanation. This is what happens when thoughts are controlled enough to survive, but not yet disciplined enough to guide purposefully. You may no longer feel overwhelmed, but you still feel unfulfilled, because calm without direction eventually turns into stagnation. Purpose does not arrive as a sudden revelation. It is not something that appears dramatically one day and remains clear forever. Purpose is shaped slowly through repeated focus, through the thoughts you return to when nothing is forcing your attention elsewhere. What you consistently think about becomes what you move toward. What you repeatedly imagine becomes what you prepare for. What you mentally rehearse becomes what you slowly build your life around. When your thoughts were uncontrolled, direction was chosen by fear. You moved away from pain rather than toward meaning. You avoided risk rather than pursuing growth. You chose comfort rather than alignment. These choices were understandable, even necessary at times, but they were not deliberate. Now, as control strengthens, a new question begins to emerge quietly within you, not loudly or urgently, but persistently. What am I actually moving toward? This question can feel unsettling because it removes excuses. When your mind is chaotic, direction feels impossible to define. When your mind becomes clearer, direction becomes unavoidable. You begin to see the gap between how you are living and how you want to live. This awareness is uncomfortable, but it is also the beginning of honesty. Without honesty, purpose cannot form. Controlled thinking allows you to sit with this discomfort without running from it. You no longer rush to distract yourself or silence the question. You let it stay. You let it mature. You allow uncertainty to exist without immediately demanding answers. This patience is critical because purpose grows in silence, not in panic. As you continue practicing control, your values begin to clarify. You notice what feels meaningful and what feels empty. You notice which activities leave you energized and which leave you drained. You notice which thoughts expand you and which shrink you. These observations are not dramatic, but they accumulate, forming a clearer picture of what matters to you beyond habit, expectation, or fear. Direction begins internally before it ever appears externally. Long before you change careers, relationships, or routines, you change what you give your attention to. Attention is the currency of purpose. Where attention goes, energy follows. Where energy follows, life moves. When you control your thoughts, you control your attention. And when you control your attention, you reclaim the ability to steer your life consciously rather than drift through it. This is also where meaning deepens. Meaning is not found in constant happiness or success. It is found in coherence, in the feeling that your actions align with your values, that your effort serves something beyond momentary comfort. Controlled thinking allows you to endure difficulty without resentment because you understand why you are doing what you are doing. Difficulty without meaning feels like suffering. Difficulty with meaning feels like growth. As direction clarifies, motivation changes its nature. You no longer rely on bursts of inspiration because inspiration is unstable. You rely on commitment because commitment is grounded. Commitment does not always feel exciting, but it feels solid. It carries you through days when motivation is absent because it is anchored in chosen direction rather than temporary emotion. This shift also changes how you experience setbacks. When direction is unclear, setbacks feel devastating because they appear to block the only visible path forward. When direction is clear, setbacks become detours rather than dead ends. You adjust without losing faith. You recalibrate without collapsing. You persist without desperation. This resilience does not come from optimism, but from clarity. Controlled thoughts also protect you from borrowed purpose. Many people unknowingly pursue lives designed by others, shaped by comparison, expectation, or fear of disapproval. When your thoughts are disciplined, you become less susceptible to these external pressures. You begin to question goals that do not feel aligned. You release ambitions that no longer resonate. You stop chasing approval and start honoring internal truth. This does not make you rigid or selfish, it makes you authentic. Authenticity is not loud or confrontational, it is quiet alignment. It is the ability to say yes without resentment and no without guilt. It is the ability to move forward without constantly explaining yourself. Controlled thinking strengthens this alignment by reducing internal conflict, allowing you to act with clarity rather than constant self-doubt. Over time, this alignment creates a sense of wholeness. You feel less fragmented, less pulled in different directions, less divided between who you are and who you pretend to be. Your inner world and outer actions begin to match. This coherence is deeply stabilizing. It reduces anxiety not by eliminating uncertainty, but by anchoring you in chosen direction regardless of outcome. As this chapter reaches its close, understand that direction is not something you set once and never revisit. It evolves as you evolve. What remains constant is the ability to choose consciously rather than react unconsciously. Controlled thoughts give you this ability. They do not guarantee ease, success, or certainty, but they guarantee authorship. You are no longer merely living a life, you are shaping one. From this point forward, your thoughts are no longer just managing the present moment. They are quietly sculpting the future. Every focused thought becomes a step. Every chosen perspective becomes momentum. Every moment of clarity becomes direction. And once direction is established, even imperfect movement becomes powerful, because it is guided, intentional, and deeply your own. Chapter Wit: The Quiet Power of Inner Peace in a Noisy World. At this stage of the journey, something subtle but profound begins to take shape within you. Something that cannot be forced, rushed, or demanded. Something that arrives only when the mind has learned how to guide itself without constant struggle, and that something is inner peace. Not the fragile kind of peace that depends on silence, comfort, or perfect circumstances, but a deeper peace that remains present even when life is demanding, unpredictable, or emotionally intense. Most people misunderstand peace. They believe peace is the absence of problems, the end of conflict, or a state of constant calm where nothing disturbs them. But this belief sets an impossible standard and turns peace into a temporary condition rather than a stable foundation. True inner peace is not the absence of disturbance. It is the ability to remain centered within disturbance, to feel emotion without being consumed by it, to face pressure without losing yourself. When your thoughts were uncontrolled, pressure felt overwhelming because it activated every fear, memory, and insecurity at once. A single challenge triggered a cascade of internal reactions, each one amplifying the next, until clarity disappeared and emotional intensity took over. Now, as control deepens, you begin to notice that pressure still arises, but it no longer hijacks your entire system. There is space between stimulus and response, and in that space, peace lives. This peace does not feel dramatic. It does not announce itself. It feels like steadiness. It feels like breathing fully even when the situation is difficult. It feels like being able to listen without preparing a defense, to pause without panic, to choose without rushing. It is quiet power, and quiet power is often underestimated because it does not demand attention. Emotional mastery does not mean you stop feeling emotions. In fact, you may feel them more clearly than ever before, because you are no longer numbing, suppressing, or escaping them. The difference is that emotions are no longer in control of direction. They become information rather than instruction. You allow them to rise, peak, and pass, knowing that none of them define who you are or what you must do next. This ability transforms how you handle stress. Stress no longer feels like an emergency that must be resolved immediately. It becomes a signal that something requires attention, adjustment, or patience. You stop adding mental resistance to physical or emotional discomfort, and in doing so, you reduce suffering significantly. Much of suffering was never caused by the situation itself, but by the mind's insistence that the situation should not be happening. As peace stabilizes, your nervous system begins to trust you. It learns that you can face discomfort without collapsing, that you can handle uncertainty without spiraling, that you can move through difficulty without losing direction. This trust changes how your body responds to challenges. Tension releases more quickly. Recovery happens faster. Emotional waves pass with less intensity. You are no longer living in constant anticipation of threat. This inner steadiness also changes how you experience the world. You become less reactive to noise, opinions, and external pressure. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop internalizing everything. You understand that not every stimulus requires a response. Not every opinion requires agreement or defense. And not every emotion requires action. Discernment replaces reactivity, and this alone brings immense relief. As emotional mastery grows, compassion deepens, both toward yourself and others. You stop judging yourself harshly for having difficult emotions because you understand their nature. You stop judging others as quickly because you recognize that they too are often reacting from uncontrolled inner worlds. This does not make you passive or permissive. It makes you grounded. Boundaries become clearer, firmer, and calmer because they are no longer fueled by fear or anger. Peace also sharpens perception. When the mind is constantly agitated, it misses nuance. It exaggerates danger and overlooks possibility. When the mind is steady, perception becomes more accurate. You see situations more clearly, people more realistically, and yourself more honestly. This clarity improves decision-making because decisions are no longer driven by emotional urgency, but by thoughtful consideration. One of the most powerful changes at this stage is how you experience silence. Silence no longer feels empty, uncomfortable, or threatening. It becomes restorative. You are no longer afraid of being alone with your thoughts, because your thoughts are no longer attacking you. This allows for reflection, insight, and creativity to emerge naturally, without force. As peace becomes familiar, you also begin to notice how much of your past behavior was driven by the desire to escape discomfort. Overworking, overthinking, constant distraction, emotional numbing. These were not flaws, they were coping strategies. Now that you no longer need to escape yourself, these patterns begin to loosen. You choose rest without guilt. You choose simplicity without fear. You choose presence without effort. This stage does not make life perfect. Difficult moments still occur. Loss still hurts. Uncertainty still challenges. But there is a deep difference between pain and suffering. Pain is unavoidable. Suffering is often created by resistance. Controlled thoughts reduce resistance, and in doing so, they transform how pain is carried. You no longer add layers of fear, judgment, and catastrophizing to what is already difficult. Inner peace also strengthens resilience. When setbacks happen, you do not collapse inward. You feel disappointment, but you do not lose self-trust. You feel frustration, but you do not abandon direction. You recover, not because you deny difficulty, but because you accept it without identifying with it. This acceptance is not resignation. It is strength that bends without breaking. As this chapter draws to a close, recognize that inner peace is not something you achieve and then protect anxiously. It is something you return to repeatedly. Some days it will feel strong, some days fragile, but its presence is no longer accidental. You know how to access it, how to rebuild it, how to protect it through awareness and choice. This peace becomes the ground from which everything else grows. Purpose becomes sustainable, relationships become healthier, work becomes more focused, life becomes less about survival and more about expression. You are no longer driven by the need to escape discomfort. You are guided by the desire to live with clarity, integrity, and steadiness. From this place, pressure no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a test of presence. Emotion no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a messenger. Life no longer feels like something happening to you. It becomes something you are participating in consciously, calmly, and fully. And as you move forward, this inner peace does not make you smaller or quieter. It makes you grounded. It makes you precise. It makes you powerful in the most enduring way, because it cannot be taken from you by noise, chaos, or circumstance. It lives within your control, shaped by your thoughts, sustained by your awareness, and strengthened every time you choose clarity over chaos and presence over panic. Chapter 9. How a controlled mind creates a life that lasts. At this point in the journey, something important becomes clear, something many people never realize until much later in life, and that is the difference between temporary satisfaction and lasting fulfillment. Temporary satisfaction comes from moments, achievements, recognition, and relief. Lasting fulfillment comes from alignment, from knowing that the way you think, the way you act, and the way you live are moving in the same direction. Controlled thoughts are what make this alignment possible, because without them, life is shaped by reaction, distraction, and impulse rather than intention. Many people reach milestones they once dreamed of and still feel restless because their inner world was never prepared to hold what they achieved. They change their circumstances, but not their consciousness. They improve their situation, but not their relationship with themselves. Fulfillment cannot be sustained in a mind that is constantly conflicted. When thoughts are scattered, even success feels unstable. When thoughts are disciplined, even simple living feels meaningful. As your thinking becomes more controlled, you begin to experience fulfillment not as excitement, but as steadiness. It feels like waking up without resistance. It feels like moving through your day without constant internal argument. It feels like being present in your own life, rather than watching it from a distance. This fulfillment is quiet, but it is deep, and because it is not dependent on constant stimulation, it lasts. This is also the stage where your life begins to influence others without effort. You stop trying to convince, impress, or explain. People sense your steadiness. They notice how you respond instead of react, how you pause instead of rush, how you remain grounded when situations become emotional. This influence is not loud, but it is powerful because it comes from consistency rather than performance. Legacy is often misunderstood as something grand or distant, something built only through fame, wealth, or extraordinary accomplishment. In reality, legacy begins in daily behavior. It is built through how you speak to people when no one is watching, how you handle pressure when things do not go your way, how you treat yourself when you make mistakes. Controlled thoughts shape these moments quietly, and these moments shape how you are remembered. When your mind is disciplined, your values stop shifting with circumstances. You act with integrity, not because it is easy, but because it is natural. You make choices that reflect who you are rather than what you fear. This consistency builds trust, both internally and externally. You trust yourself because your actions align with your principles. Others trust you because your behavior is predictable in the best way. Long-term fulfillment also changes how you relate to time. You are no longer obsessed with rushing toward the future or escaping the present. You plan without anxiety. You work without urgency. You rest without guilt. Time becomes something you move with rather than fight against. This relationship with time reduces regret, because regret often comes from living disconnected from your values rather than from specific outcomes. As controlled thinking stabilizes, you also begin to accept impermanence more peacefully. You understand that phases end, roles change, and circumstances shift. Instead of clinging desperately or resisting change, you adapt. This adaptability does not come from detachment, but from inner security. You know that while situations may change, your ability to respond thoughtfully remains. One of the most freeing realizations at this stage is that you no longer need to prove your worth. Worth is no longer negotiated through achievement or approval. It is assumed, embodied, and expressed through how you live. This removes an enormous burden, because so much mental energy was once spent trying to justify existence rather than simply inhabiting it fully. Fulfillment deepens when you begin to see life as a contribution rather than a competition. You stop measuring success only by personal gain and start considering impact, presence, and meaning. This does not require self-sacrifice or grand gestures. It happens naturally when your thoughts are no longer consumed by insecurity. When you are internally steady, you have more attention available for others, for creativity, for service, for building something that outlasts immediate reward. Even solitude changes at this stage. Being alone no longer feels empty or heavy. It feels complete. You enjoy your own company because your inner dialogue is no longer hostile or chaotic. Reflection becomes nourishing rather than draining. Silence becomes a space for integration rather than avoidance. Challenges still appear, but they no longer threaten your sense of self. Failure does not collapse identity. Success does not inflate it. You remain balanced because your foundation is internal rather than external. This balance is rare, and it is the reason people who reach it often seem calm in situations that unsettle others. As this chapter comes to a close, understand that fulfillment is not a destination you arrive at and stay forever. It is a way of living that must be maintained through awareness, discipline, and honesty. There will be moments when old patterns try to return, when distraction pulls at your attention, when fear attempts to reclaim control. What has changed is not that these moments disappear, but that you recognize them quickly and respond wisely. A controlled mind does not guarantee a perfect life, but it guarantees a lived one, a life where days are not merely survived, but experienced, a life where actions reflect values, a life where presence replaces panic, a life that feels whole even when it is imperfect. This is the kind of life that lasts, not because it is dramatic, but because it is grounded, not because it is admired, but because it is authentic, not because it avoids difficulty, but because it meets difficulty with clarity and calm strength. And from this place of fulfillment, the final transformation becomes possible, where everything you have learned settles into wisdom, and wisdom quietly shapes the way you move through the world. Chapter 10. The life you live when your mind is finally working with you. There comes a moment, often quiet and unannounced, when you realize that you are no longer fighting yourself, and this realization changes the texture of your entire life. Nothing dramatic may have happened externally. Your environment may look the same. Your responsibilities may still be there. Your challenges may not have disappeared. But internally, something has shifted so deeply that the way you move through every moment is different, because your mind is no longer pulling you in 100 directions at once. This is the life that begins when your thoughts are no longer competing for control, when fear is no longer the loudest voice, and when clarity has become more familiar than chaos. You wake up without the same internal resistance you once carried. You move into the day with a sense of orientation rather than confusion. Even when uncertainty is present, it no longer feels threatening, because you trust your ability to respond rather than your ability to predict. When the mind works with you instead of against you, decision-making becomes simpler, not because choices are easier, but because they are cleaner. You are no longer paralyzed by over-analysis or driven by impulse. You consider, you feel, you decide, and you move. Regret loses its power because decisions are made from awareness rather than reaction. Even when outcomes are not perfect, you do not turn against yourself, because you know you acted with the best clarity available at the time. This internal cooperation transforms effort. Work no longer feels like constant resistance. Focus becomes easier to sustain, because attention is no longer fragmented by endless mental noise. You can stay with a task, a conversation, or a moment without feeling the urge to escape it. This presence improves everything it touches. Relationships deepen because you are actually there. Learning accelerates because your mind is not fighting itself. Creativity flows because it is no longer blocked by fear of judgment. One of the most profound changes at this stage is how you experience difficulty. Difficulty no longer feels personal. Challenges arise, but they are met with curiosity rather than panic, with steadiness rather than collapse. You ask better questions. You respond rather than react. You adjust rather than abandon. This does not make you emotionless. You still feel disappointment, sadness, frustration, and loss. But these emotions no longer dictate your identity or direction. They are experienced fully and released naturally. Life also becomes quieter internally, not silent but spacious. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer crowd each other. There is room to breathe inside your own mind. This spaciousness allows intuition to surface, because intuition cannot be heard over constant mental argument. You begin to sense when something is right or wrong for you without needing endless justification. This clarity feels grounded, not impulsive, because it is supported by awareness rather than urgency. As your inner world stabilizes, your outer life begins to reflect that stability in subtle ways. You stop overcommitting because you understand your limits. You stop tolerating what drains you unnecessarily because you respect your energy. You stop chasing what does not align because you trust your direction. These changes may seem small, but they accumulate, creating a life that feels intentional rather than accidental. This is also where gratitude deepens. Not the forced kind, not the kind that dismisses pain, but a quiet appreciation for being present in your own life. You notice moments you once rushed past. You feel grounded in simple experiences. You recognize how much of suffering came not from life itself, but from the way your mind related to it. This awareness does not create bitterness. It creates compassion for who you were and respect for how far you have come. A controlled mind also changes how you relate to uncertainty about the future. You still plan, you still prepare, but you no longer need guarantees. You trust your ability to adapt. You trust your resilience. You trust your clarity. This trust is earned through practice, through countless moments where you chose awareness over reaction and discovered that you could handle more than you thought. As this way of living settles in, wisdom replaces effort. You no longer need to constantly remind yourself of principles because they have become embodied. You naturally pause, you naturally reflect, you naturally choose steadiness. This is what integration feels like. The lessons are no longer ideas you remember, they are habits you live. You also begin to understand that control is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you return to. Some days will be harder. Some moments will catch you off guard. Old patterns may resurface under stress or exhaustion, but now you recognize them quickly. You recover faster. You realign sooner. What once took weeks now takes moments. This is mastery, not perfection. The life you live now is not free of pain, but it is free of unnecessary suffering. It is not free of challenge, but it is free of constant inner conflict. You still grow, you still stretch, you still face uncertainty, but you do so from a place of self-leadership rather than self-sabotage. As this chapter comes to a close, take a moment to recognize what has changed. You are no longer waiting to be saved by circumstances. You are no longer hoping that one external event will fix everything. You understand that the most powerful transformation was internal, and that it happened not through force, but through attention, patience, and discipline. This is the life that begins when your thoughts are no longer running unchecked, when your mind is no longer a battlefield, and when your inner world becomes a place you can live in peacefully. From here, growth continues naturally. Direction remains clear, presence deepens, and life, in all its complexity, becomes something you participate in fully rather than endure. You have not become someone else. You have become more yourself. Not the version shaped by fear, noise, and habit, but the version guided by clarity, awareness, and intention. And from this place, whatever comes next will be met not with panic, but with calm strength, because your mind is finally working with you, and that changes everything. As this audiobook comes to a close, allow yourself to sit quietly for a moment, not to analyze what you heard, not to evaluate it, but simply to feel the space that has opened inside you. You have not been given something new. You have been reminded of something you always carried, the ability to guide your inner world rather than be ruled by it. Nothing in your external life needs to change immediately for this work to matter. Transformation does not begin with dramatic decisions or sudden reinvention. It begins with awareness, with noticing, with the smallest moments where you pause instead of react, where you choose presence instead of habit, where you respond with clarity rather than fear. These moments may feel insignificant, but they are the building blocks of a different life. You will return to your routines, your responsibilities, your relationships, and your challenges. Thoughts will still arise. Emotions will still move through you. Some days will feel easy, others heavy. This is not a failure of the work. This is life continuing. What has changed is not the absence of difficulty, but your relationship with it. When your mind becomes loud again, remember that you do not need to silence it. You only need to stop obeying it blindly. When fear speaks, remember that it is a signal, not a verdict. When doubt appears, remember that it is a habit, not a truth. You are not required to believe everything you think. You are only required to notice. Return to the practice of awareness gently, again and again, not with pressure, not with self-judgment, with patience, with consistency, with respect for the process. Each return strengthens the path. Each moment of clarity reinforces the foundation you have built. Your life will continue to unfold, but it will do so differently now because you are no longer moving unconsciously. You are no longer being dragged by every thought, every emotion, every impulse. You are walking with intention. You are choosing your direction. You are living from the inside out. This is not an ending. It is a beginning that does not announce itself loudly. It is the beginning of a life lived with steadiness, with presence, and with quiet confidence. A life where peace is not something you chase, but something you return to. A life where growth is not forced, but allowed. A life where your mind becomes a place of support rather than struggle. Carry this awareness with you. Let it guide you when you forget. Let it steady you when you feel lost. Let it remind you that control is not about perfection, but about returning to yourself again and again. And as you step back into your life, step back differently, slower, clearer, more present. Because once you learn to control your thoughts, your whole life does not just change. It begins.